Every day, you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. And so many people I hear about go to a medical provider or even from their coach here, your core is just weak. Your core is not strong enough. If you got stronger core, you wouldn't have back pain. Now, while I do think that in some athletes that more core strength is important, and also while I do think that as a coach, core conditioning is vital and you have to do it every single day to a high degree, think about the nature of the argument, right? If all we needed in gymnastics was more core strength to make back pain go away, a lot of people in gymnastics would not have back pain, because I know a lot of gymnasts that do core every single day, hard. Leg lifts, hollow rocks, V-ups, arch ups, side planks, tons and tons and tons of core work. And I still know a lot of people with back pain in gymnastics. So while there is a subset of people, particularly the younger athletes who are very hypermobile, maybe who don't have the best body control or stiffness during their technique, they don't have great technique, they may need more core bracing strategies and strength because the forces that I mentioned above are too much for them to handle. And when they try to do these skills, it puts a lot of pressure on their lower back. There are definitely cases that I've seen like that. That being said, I think the more common situations is that it's core control, which is the issue. And shout out to my friend, Dr. Josh Eldridge, who popularized this in like 2013, for me anyways. But core control is more the ability to connect your brain to your muscles in your spine and brace in a way that uses all of those muscles to protect you against the high forces. Okay, so that's a little bit different. And you need to understand how to brace those core muscles, how to breathe properly, and try to use all of those muscles as a unit, protecting your lower back against those high forces. That's very different than someone who just needs to do 50 more leg lifts per day. Okay. And I believe that core control is more so an issue in gymnasts because they oftentimes are doing such high intensity, fast skills that we maybe skip steps and don't teach them how to brace and breathe. And also, as I'll talk about next, we don't do conditioning styles that are in line with general principles and gymnastic specific and put somebody under load, under weights, dumbbells, kettlebells, barbells, where they are forced to brace their core under a high degree of external load. And so what happens is we have this mismatch of they don't understand how to brace their core properly and breathe properly, how to move their arms and their legs around that core brace. And then we don't use conditioning that exposes them to higher forces that requires them to breathe and use that brace under load, not just jumping and gymnastic skills. And it causes a situation where someone's maybe not going to be able to tolerate a 1.5 punch front. They lose their core and they buckle and it jars their back. That's very common for someone who has some stress reaction. Okay. Also, maybe it's a situation where someone doesn't understand how to brace their core. They don't get this core conditioning. So the bottom of a ring giant, the bottom of a Tkachev tap, the bottom of a giant, they're not really strong there and they don't know how to brace, and it pulls in their back and it causes quite a bit of pain. So, right, you can see this is the back. These are the pointy things that point out of your back, right? This is called the spinous process, right? And then you have on the sides here what are called transverse processes, right? So you can see now, if I bend forward, right, or if a gymnast bends forward, you can see how those joints open. These are called facet joints. Okay, so they open when someone bends forward, and importantly for a gymnast, they close when someone bends backwards, right? So if I bend backwards, you can see how there's less space between those joints. And you can also see how there's maybe less space between the spinous process and the back here. All right. And the reason that matters is because when somebody back bends, sometimes in gymnastics, you have extreme back bending motions, or also you can have impact based issues that cause these joints to get cranky, but also cause maybe these bones to bump into each other and get bruised, or also cause, very importantly, this area right between, you can see it here between these joints. This is called the pars anticularis. And it's the site of stress fractures in gymnastics, right? So if someone bends backwards a lot, or if somebody has a lot of impact and arching together, what happens is that these joints can no longer move more, and it starts to put pressure on this bone right here. And it causes, in an arch specifically, it causes one bone to start to move forward, right? And this other model I can show you has this. So we'll go through the actual injuries here, but you can see how if I keep back bending or landing over and over again, it can put pressure right where this line is here. See that little gap, right? See how it's not connected? What happens there is that you can put so much pressure with landing that one disc starts to slide and one vertebrae starts to slide forward over each other. And right, that is what happens with the stress fractures, that these bones, this pars anticularis and what's called the neural arch, it fractures right here, right? And someone on the top one, you can see it, right? And what happens is because that fractures, that bone on top starts to slide forward. And that's obviously not good because the fracture site is painful and awful, but also it starts to move forward like this if it keeps going. And that's what a spondylolysis is. I'll go over this later, but you can have a facet syndrome, which is just an irritation of the facet joint, that joint that I talked about right here. That makes common impact. That's a facet joint, right? You can have facet irritation. If things keep going, the next progression is usually a stress reaction, which is when you can see a hairline fracture on MRI or X-ray right here, right? And you can see it fracturing up top as well, right? So you would have a hairline fracture that starts, and then you can have a progression of this, which would be the actual fracture I talked about in the other model. That's a spondylolysis, which is where the pars neural arch actually fractures. If that disc starts to slide forward, that's called a spondylolisthesis, right? It refers to sliding of one vertebrae forward over each other, and they grade that based on how far it is, okay? Right? These deeper muscles, right, are smaller. Again, they typically work reflexively, so you can't like think about flex my multifidi, right? Like that's one of the muscles that's very commonly talked about, the deep subsystem, or the deep active subsystem is the multifidi, because it's so important to help stabilize joints side to side. It can be commonly injured in someone who has an irritation, like with a landing posture, but I can't think flex my multifidi, right? Like that's not consciously controllable. The way that's typically we do that is reflexive activation through breathing patterns and bracing patterns. That has shown if we breathe and brace properly from work from many, many great researchers, Stuart McGill, Leon Chateau is a breathing researcher who's shown this really well. If we do this properly, we'll get these muscles to fire pretty well. There was a lot of talk in the 90s about the transverse abdominis, which is another kind of deep muscle. And, it's important, right? But it's not the most important. It's more important holistically to brace everything together than it is just hollow and use your transverse abdominis, as a lot of great research has shown us in high-level sports. But essentially, back to my point, is that the multifidi, things like the rotaries, the transversalis, right? These muscles are very small and they go between these ligaments, right? They go between these bones to help stabilize these ligaments, right? They can commonly be irritated if somebody does have a buckling event like 1.5 punch. You can have somebody who maybe does have some multifidi pain. That's a common theory in the research, that maybe there is some causing of pain from that structure. But they're deep, right? They're deep. They're reflexively activated. Okay. They work to protect the spine at a smaller level. They're not these big giant muscles that we have in our core. Okay. There's three main things injury wise that happen in back pain. There's more than this, but let's just go with this. Number one, with straight extension, just straight back bending, you can cause impingement between the top bone and the bottom bone here. This is called spinous process impingement. So you can back bend here and have spinous process impingement. There can be a bone bruise between these two. Now, I'm not going to go through the test. We'll talk about that in a second, just in the sake of not confusing people. So back bending can have an occasion where these two bones bump together. Now, these joints on the side here, right? These two joints I talked about, the facet joints on each side, you can also have irritation of one side, right? So say if someone has a backwards with rotation, right? That can stress the facet joint here. Okay. And we talked about this a little bit. The starting point of most gymnasts' back pain is facet syndrome. So facet syndrome is when, whether from back bending or from turning or from landing or twisting or a lot of back bending, one side gets really painful, right? And you could argue it's the joint capsule. You could argue it's the muscles around the joint capsule. You've strained a multifidi. But that's like the deep ache that people feel when their back starts to hurt. Is usually something coming from these joints being cranky and irritable. Okay. I'll be honest, a lot of gymnasts don't seek out medical services when they have baseline levels of pain like that. They think it's normal. They brush it off. They try to train through it. But it's usually a combination of the facet being irritated, the muscles around it being irritated, or if you're in the pain science world, high tissue sensitivity with high nociceptive drive due to a repetitive movement of backwards bending and compression. Okay. So that being said, the progression of this is, if, like I said, if this joint continues to get a lot of back bending, someone keeps training, they do high compression forces, they're not landing properly, they're not doing respective workloads. The next progression of this can be what's called a stress reaction. Okay. So a stress reaction is where, like I said, the bone, the pars up here, right, or down here, depending on the level you're working with, the pars itself starts to get increased signaling, and it starts to become inflamed. So there's bony inflammation, and you can sometimes see a hairline fracture through, or a hairline starting to go through there, right? That can be causing the stress reaction of the pars inticularis, right? Or the neural arch as well. So with that said, that's the second kind of degree of extension-based back pain that's on one side usually, is a stress reaction. Okay. So if somebody gets imaging done and they get it right away, they might catch it, right? This person might be in a brace for 4 to 6 weeks to prevent them from bending backwards. If you live on the West Coast, they might not use a brace at all. Controversy there in the literature, but it's usually a little bit easier to deal with because it just takes time for the stress reaction to calm down. You can let the back heal. You can slowly go through the rehab process. Now, it doesn't happen all the time. If they continue to backbend, continue to train, continue to ignore their pain, don't get it looked at, maybe they get an MRI that doesn't have a heavy enough T3 weight and it doesn't pick up their imaging issue, they can actually fracture. So this is spondylolysis. Okay. So what this is, it's sometimes called the Scotty dog with a collar fracture, because on x-ray, it looks like a Scotty dog with a little collar around his neck. But essentially you have fractured the bone of that pars, which is right here. Okay. So this fracture then, because of the repetitive extension and the sliding going on of this first one relative to the second one, causes that fracture to actually happen through. And again, I can show you in this model because this is a stress fracture here. So in this model right here in a stress fracture, you can see that if I keep backbending, right, this would slide forward and you see that fracture start to pop up right there, right here, right? So as it slides, you can see how now as I backbend, right, it's going to start moving forward relative to the other disc because we now have a fracture in that spotty dog collar. It's a little tough with the lighting, but yeah, you can see it. Okay. So that is a stress fracture. That is a full fracture of the bone. That is a spondylolysis. Okay. And again, from repetitive extension and rotation and possibly compression. Okay. That's on one side. The last progression of this, first, this person is probably going to be braced. Where I live in Boston, it's the Boston overlap brace. So it's more prone to be braced. But usually you're in a brace for 3 months because you need to stabilize that fracture and prevent it. There's research debating of whether it's actually stabilizing the fracture. It might be moving. It might be more symptom management, that somebody it's just not moving their back and irritating the muscles or the bones, not rubbing around each other. But they'll probably be in a brace. They go through a rehab process. It's usually 3 months in the brace and then another 3 months of rehab and getting them stronger again and then return to sport program. In my opinion, it usually takes about 6 to 8 months to do it properly. Sometimes less if you have a stress reaction. Obviously, it might be 3 to 4 months in total. Facet syndrome might just be 4 to 6 weeks. We'll talk about later. Okay. But one analogy that I really, really like from Adrian Lau is this analogy of, an alarm system at your house. And I think young athletes, and I also think people who are scared with back pain, if I was someone who was not educated and had a consumer mentality, I'd be a little bit nervous too about my back. But one thing that I really like to tell them is, your brain has this system for protecting you. And so pain is actually an output of the brain to keep you safe. If we didn't have pain, we could have some bad things happen. Imagine if you didn't have pain, you were walking along the beach, you stepped on a piece of glass and you didn't notice it because you had no pain. And then you walk, 4 or 5 minutes down the road and you pass out because of blood loss. You look behind you, there's blood all the way down the beach because there was no pain to protect you. So pain is oftentimes thought about as something that's bad, but it's very important we educate people that, it's a good thing to have because it alerts you of possible danger. And we don't want to freak out and say, oh my God, everything's the worst thing ever. You're never going to do gymnastics. Like, you don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but you want to be realistic with someone and say, hey, listen, your brain is trying to tell you that something is going on here. We need to work on. And if we don't take care of it, we could have some problems. We could have some irritation where you keep getting worse. You don't get to do the things you love. So our goal is to use this pain as a signal and figure out what we can do to lower this threshold of sensitivity, right? And so the alarm system is really, really helpful because you tell people that, hey, in a normal situation, your body has an alarm system to alert you to things that are not so great and that we want to make sure that you're aware of, right? So with that being said, when you have an alarm system going off in your house, the alarm system is set to a certain threshold of burglars trying to steal your stuff. So when somebody breaks into your house or when something goes wrong, it doesn't meet the normal pattern, your brain or your alarm system goes off to alert somebody that something's wrong. So in this situation, what that analogy compares to is that in a normal situation, without any sensitivity, without any input of danger from your body, nervousness, you have a high threshold for force and for skills, right? You can do gymnastics, you can run, you can tumble, you can do all this kind of stuff. Your back feels great. But what happened here is because of something sensitivity-wise, it lowered the threshold of that alarm. So now we have things that normally wouldn't set your alarm off are now creating the alarm to kind of go off and produce pain as an output. So in the analogy of the house, now instead of a burglar causing the alarm to go off, the mailman coming to drop off your mail or leaves blowing by your house is triggering the alarm. And it doesn't make sense, right? That's not a threat. That's not something that would be dangerous. But for some reason, right, because of that lowered sensitivity or lowered threshold, those things are causing the alarm to go off. And that's what happened. That's what's happening right now. Because of the sensitivity, because of this awkward landing, because of the time that you've had continued backbending going on, your brain is really protecting you. And we need to find a way to reduce the stress on that area, to reduce the sensitivity that will lower the gating there. And then that will also, with exercise, with slow exposure back to the things you want to do, will reset the alarm and will kind of convince your brain that like, hey, things are okay here. My body's healing. My body's strong. I can handle this. But it's all about playing with exercise and workloads to rebuild that tolerance to capacity, to force. And that's what good strength conditioning is. That's what good exercise programs are. Really, really well. Again, with education, showing you care, and having a consistency over intensity mindset. Don't go bananas on 4,000 exercises. Just take 4 to 5 that really work for them. Let's consistently do those to feel better. All right. In the intermediate phase of rehabilitation, a lot of what I'm doing is really focusing on exercise. That middle portion is really for me about just getting them active again, getting them to get kind of more involved and trying to make them feel better. So one thing we do is we progress all the core work, right? So we progress all the core work to more advanced versions of the things that we just talked about. So I'm trying to get into a program anti-flexion, anti-extension, anti-side bending, anti-rotating, and then anti-compression, along with maybe some extra stuff here and there. So I might progress people to do bear crawling, straight knee side planks instead of a bent knee side plank, maybe lifting the top leg. Plank drag throughs are really, really great. Wall press dead bugs, sled pushes, sled pulls, suitcase carries, farmer's carries. If it's appropriate, we'll start doing some lower body loading, which I'll talk about next, but really advancing all the core stuff. Stability ball, stir the pot, trunk stability, curl ups from Stu McGill. Whatever I can possibly do to build a nice core program around that, right? Combined with a lot of lower body, upper body work. So I'm trying to get somebody back to the main movement patterns of upper body and lower body. So for lower body, squatting, hinging, split pelvis, and then single leg. So I'm trying to do usually glute bridges, single leg glute bridges first with weight. That's usually more comfortable. Eventually getting to a kettlebell deadlift for anti-flexion training, which is great too for hinging. Squatting, goblet squatting is usually good to a box. I usually start splits pelvis and step up stuff more aggressively in the other two patterns because they are a little bit more back loading. I take those off a little bit more, but split squats, rear foot elevated split squats, front foot elevated split squats. If someone has extension based back pain, I probably will go with a front foot elevated split squat first to tilt them forward so they're not arching their back. If someone has flexion based back pain, I'll probably go with a rear foot elevated split squat first to get them more in an upright posture. But lots of split squats, lots of step ups, lots of step downs. I love doing sleds, sled pushes, sled pulls, lateral drags. I love doing loaded carries, suitcase carries, farmer carries. All that kind of stuff is phenomenal. And then for the upper body, whatever they can tolerate, right? Horizontal pushing and pulling, overhead pushing and pulling, and then accessory work. I'm trying to build a holistic strength and conditioning program around these things. So it might be 1A might be a 4x8 split squat. 1B might be push-ups, 4x8 push-ups. 1C might be a suitcase carry march. And then for 2A, we might have some sort of a squat. So a goblet squat, for example. 2B might be the rowing, so feet elevated rows or face pulls. 1C might be stability ball, stir the pot, or an anti-rotation press through. I'll get all the categories into a 2-day program. I'll probably see them once and I'll help them with whatever they need me for to teach them exercises, update things, make sure they're feeling good. And I'll write a 2 to 3 day home program and have them go nuts on that. But it's all about strength conditioning here, right? Trying to get the baseline leg patterns, advance the core work, make sure they're feeling better with their pain and trying to slowly get them back to what they want to do. That honestly takes up a good 4-week progression of integrating all these things together and getting them to feel comfortable.